Okay, so let's now add a S3 bucket. So we're going to use this S3 bucket to upload our images and have our hosted images there. So we don't need our own server with a volume. We can just use S3. So we need to set up a S3 bucket as a resource type. So let's actually first go to the documentation. Okay, so here I am at the AWS S3 bucket CloudFormation, and here it gives us again the properties that we can set. And if you take a look, pretty much none of these properties are required. You literally just need to set up a bucket with a resource with the type of AWS S3 bucket. But we are going to set a few other properties as well. So feel free to come and look at what those properties do in detail at this page. Okay, so back in the code, we are going to create a new resource and we're going to call it the main bucket. And this will be of type AWS S3 bucket. And the properties that we want to set, you can see it doesn't provide any default properties because by default it doesn't require any other properties. So we can run SLS deploy now and it would create a S3 bucket for us. So this is a pretty simple resource, but we're going to give this bucket a specific name. And the idea with S3 buckets is they need to be unique for the region that they are in. So we are currently in the EU Central 1 region, so the bucket name should be unique for everybody, not just for your own account. So try and get some unique names. So I'm going to choose my full stack junkie domain as a prefix, and then I'm just going to describe what this bucket is. It's the book API bucket. So you can probably add your name with like some random characters in front with the same name and it should work. And if you're in the same region, obviously. If you're not, then yeah, basically it just needs to be unique. Okay, so let's actually just add these properties to describe the bucket and then we go ahead and deploy. So I'm going to call SLS deploy and let's actually go ahead and see what it does. So I'm going to head over back to the dashboard and I'm going to take a look at our current buckets. So if I refresh here, I can see we only have the development serverless bucket that deploys the code and the CloudFormation. We don't have a bucket yet. Oh, there we see a bucket. Okay, so we have the FSJ book API bucket. So this is the one that we declared in here. Okay, and this is not even completely deployed yet, but this bucket resource part of the step was obviously already done. So if I take a look at this bucket, we can see there's no objects in there. We can view some of the properties and some of these permissions we will be setting through the serverless framework and the CloudFormation for the bucket. Here we can view some metrics, management and access points. So let's actually set up two more important parts of this bucket so that we are able to generate pre-signed URLs. I'm actually gonna wait on that and let's create the endpoint or the Lambda function that would go ahead and generate this pre-signed URL for us. So I'm gonna call this Lambda function generate pre-signed URL, and this will have a handler which would go to app handlers. And let's call it generate pre-signed URL handler and the handler function that gets exported. Now I just want to use this as example. We have a description and this would basically generate upload URL for S3 bucket. Okay, and the event that would trigger this would also be a HTTP event, and the path would be generate pre-signed URL. The method would be a get request because we just want to get, and the CORS and the privacy flags we don't need to worry about now. Okay, so here we have this definition of a function. Now let's go ahead and actually create this handler. Okay, so now we have this handler. Let's create the class, generate pre-signed URL handler, which will have a constructor, and let's export this asynchronous function called handler that receives an event, but we're not going to use that event. We'll have a try catch where we do some stuff. I'm going to actually copy from here. I'm going to copy this part and I'm going to paste it in. I'm just going to change this class definition instance to be the handler above. This handler will then receive not the book model instance, but we are going to create another client and then just inject the client directly into this handler. So we want a async function called process event, and we don't need to pass in the event because we're just going to respond with something. Okay, so there we have this. Let's change the error messages. Error generating pre-signed URL. Okay, so this will still be the same. And the constructor, what do we want to be dependency injected? Well, we're going to create a new handler, and this handler will allow us to talk to S3. So we'll call it the S3 client. And I'm just going to copy this over here because it will be pretty much similar, but it won't be a DynamoDB client. It would be the S3 client, and then we won't have this intermediary step. We can just export that down here. So now we need to install that SDK of the S3 client. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say yarn add the AWS SDK / client -S3. Okay, so now that is installed, we will need to install another package, and this would be the pre-sign URL package. So the S3 request pre-signer package. Okay, now that we have that, we can import this S3 client. S3 client. Let's remove this. Is it gonna pick it up? No. Okay, let's import it. Import S3 client from AWS S3. Okay, here we go. Now we need to import that S3 client, and we can say create S3 client. Are we not exporting this function? Oh, this is still not named correctly. S3, create S3. Okay, now we have this S3 client, which we should add to the constructor as well. Okay, so we need to inject that into the dependency. Okay, so now we can actually, in this S3 client, we can create the part that uploads, or we can generate the pre-signed URL. Okay, so what do we need to do here? First of all, we will need to create an upload key. So S3 saves files also with this key string type structure. So very similar to DynamoDB and Redis type where you build your strings. So you can almost build directories with these. So I'm just going to create an uploads folder. You can almost see it as a folder. And then I'm going to give it a unique name for that file that's being uploaded. So I'm going to import from version 4 as UUID from the UUID package. Okay, so now we generate a unique upload key, and then we want to generate a command. So we can then again say put object command, and this put object command should be imported. Let's see from here, put object command, there we go. Okay, and then we need to provide some properties, the bucket name. So we called this bucket FSJ book API bucket, and then the key is this upload key that we've just created. So that's basically it, right? This is as simple as it is. We need to do a put to this bucket with this key, and if we provide the signing part of this logic, so this is where we use the other package, the get sign URL, which is also not being imported. Let me reload my VS Code. Sometimes that works. There we go. So we have this function, and we need to await the response, which will be the pre-signed URL. And to this function, we need to then pass in our current S3 client. We need to pass in the command that was generated above, and then we have some options that we can set. So one is expires in, and we want to set the expiration date for this URL. So if it doesn't get used in 900 seconds, then it expires. That's 15 minutes. Okay, so we want to return with this API call a status code of 200 with a body of a JSON string that contains the image URL that will be saved to the database, and we will structure that now, and then the upload URL, which would ultimately upload, which would be used to upload the image. So this, we are sending this to the client already so that the client can save this to the database, because this would be the actual URL, and I'll show you in a sec how do we get there. So let's maybe keep that out of it for now. Okay, so this is basically the logic of creating a pre-signed URL. So let's actually go ahead and deploy this and see what we get from there. So I'm going to say SLS deploy, and this should deploy this function, get pre-signed URL, which points to this handler. We do some injections here with a S3 client. Then we use the get signed URL package to actually generate this pre-signed URL. We provided the client, the S3 client, our command and some other settings, and then we return with that upload URL. Okay, so once this is deployed, we should be able to make the following request. Okay, so here we can see the generate pre-signed URL function was created. So let's copy this endpoint, and I'm going to make a GET request to this endpoint. When we make this GET request to our pre-signed URL endpoint, we get a URL which we can now use to upload an image. So I'm just going to create a new tab. I'm going to paste in that endpoint. Be sure to make it a put request. And here we can see this endpoint pre-signed URL that we got back has a bunch of other stuff. The expiration date, some security token headers, what the ID we're making a put object request, and yes, you can do a few other checks with this pre-signed URL package that could make it more secure, only limited to specific sizes, etc. So let's actually go ahead and choose a file. In my binary data, I'm going to choose just some image, and I'm going to hit send, and we get this error, access denied. So why are we getting this error, access denied? And after some Googling and searching and figuring out, it came down to that this handler that's generating the pre-signed URL itself doesn't have access to actually do anything with S3. So we need to, under the IAM roles, add another action to allow S3 actions. So I'm just going to allow all S3 actions just to keep it simple, but you can refine this to specific S3 actions if you'd like. So now if I were to deploy this again with that small change of just adding a S3 allow rule, then it means that whenever this URL is generated, this URL actually has the privilege to do things with S3, in this case do a put of an object. So that was a quite tricky find, but that would be the idea, right? That this Lambda that creates this pre-signed URL actually has the rights to do this put command. And yeah, with this add, we could have just said put object, but at a later stage we want to be able to read as well. So yeah, we could probably refine it a bit better. Put object and S3 get object. But yeah, just gonna keep it like this for now. And this is probably all deployed. Yes, it is. So now let's try it again. I'm gonna create a new pre-signed URL. I'm gonna take this URL, make sure to copy it nicely, and I'm gonna add it in here. And I'm just gonna keep the same image, and I'm gonna upload. And now we see we get a status code of 200 and there's no response. So now if I go to my S3 dashboard and I do a refresh here, we can now see there is actually files under upload. So I've uploaded an extra one as well during some testing. But yeah, here we've uploaded our image. And if we were to click on this URL link, we again see access denied. And you're like, okay, but shouldn't I be able to see this now? And this is another rule of S3. By default, S3 is closed to the public, so you can't access it. Okay, so by default, if we look at the permissions of a S3 bucket, we can see we block all public access, and there's no bucket policy that allows us to actually read objects from this bucket. So that are the two things that we still need to configure, and then we will be able to have bucket uploads. So let's go and do that. So back in the serverless file, under the resource of the main bucket, we need to add a new piece of property. And I'm just going to paste this in here. But basically it's the public access blocking configuration, and we want to turn all of this to false to allow this bucket to be accessed publicly. And we can do that in the console as well by editing this and then just unselecting all of this and hitting save. But like I mentioned before, we should try and not do stuff in the console. We can use the console more of just validating what the console might be a bit more descriptive about stuff. Okay, so after we've added this part, we first need to deploy this before we can add the bucket policy, which is going to be another resource type, which is going to allow us to access objects publicly. So once this is deployed, we can go back and view that it has actually turned off all of these access block configurations. Okay, so that is deployed. Now let's go check that out. If I were to refresh here, we can see that on has turned to off, and if we edit this, we can see by default this are all toggled off now. Okay, but this still did not change the fact that I am not able to view my images. So if I were to go here and view, it still says access denied. So that's only the first part that we needed to do. I keep closing the tab. But yeah, that was the first part we needed to do, was to toggle that permissions on the bucket. These block all public access. Now we need to add a bucket policy to allow get objects. So let's do that in the code base. Okay, so let's actually add in a new resource type. So we're going to add a main bucket policy. Let's just call it main bucket policy. And this will be a type of AWS S3 bucket policy. And this will have properties, which will be the bucket name, which we have book API bucket. And then we have some policy statements that we need to add here. So we can add a statement, and this will effectively allow an effect with the principal of asterisk and the action of S3 get object. So we are allowing this get object, and the resource we are pointing to will be ARN, so we can get this resource details from the console. So here from the console under properties, we can see our prefix for the ARN. So we can copy that and paste in our ARN over here. And we should postfix it with a slash and the asterisk or wildcard. So now we can deploy this part, SLS deploy. Okay, so now that that is complete, now we can go look at our console. We can do a refresh over here and go under permissions. And now we can see this public access is toggled off, and we actually have a policy added here. And you can see that this statement and the syntax of the effect allow principal action, what action it is, and then what resource matches what we have in the code over here. So I'm hoping that this video series kind of just makes the journey into serverless and some of the AWS services a lot more clear and less overwhelming. So yeah, that's ultimately the goal. So now we should be able to access the objects. So if I go to the object and I view objects link, it should download the image. And if I view this image, there we can see this is the image that was uploaded. So now we actually have this URL over here, and this is the image URL that we're going to save in the database as well. So when we have this generate pre-signed URL, we want to respond with the image URL as well. But this image URL will have this format. So I copied it from here. And basically, we're just gonna add the key ourselves. So the upload key is that last part of the URL. So we just add our own upload key in there. And now we should return the actual uploaded URL of the image. And that can be saved to the database. So let's actually do that part to finish off this, like, let's say, MVP of our serverless project, where we've kind of learned a bunch of stuff. And in the rest of the videos, we'll kind of start doing some more refactoring and discussing some other topics that might occur.